Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's story, if you're dealing with housing troubles, whether you're struggling to find affordable rent, facing eviction, or just trying to navigate this insane market, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're here every week breaking down what's really happening in housing across America, giving you the information and resources you need to protect yourself and your family. We're not just talking about problems, we're talking about solutions. So subscribe now, because this affects all of us. Now, let's talk about what's happening in Florida, because it's absolutely wild, and honestly, it should terrify anyone who cares about where they're going to live in the next 5 years. Florida's housing market isn't just struggling. It's not just cooling off. It's imploding. And Governor Ron DeSantis, the man who spent the last few years building his national profile, is now facing serious backlash as thousands of Floridians watch their dreams of homeownership or even basic affordable housing completely fall apart. Here's the thing that nobody's really talking about in the mainstream coverage. This isn't just about market forces. This isn't just supply and demand doing its natural thing. What's happening in Florida right now is a result of specific policy choices, aggressive development patterns, and a complete failure to protect residents from predatory practices that have turned the Sunshine State into a playground for investors and a nightmare for actual people trying to live there. Let's start with the numbers, because they're staggering. The median home price in Florida skyrocketed over the past few years, with cities like Miami, Tampa, and Orlando seeing increases that made them some of the most unaffordable markets in the entire country. We're talking about median prices that jumped 30, 40, sometimes 50% in just a couple of years. Meanwhile, wages didn't keep up, not even close. So you had this massive gap opening up where regular working Floridians, teachers, nurses, firefighters, service workers, were being priced out communities they served. But here's where it gets really interesting. While all this was happening, DeSantis and the Florida legislature were busy passing laws that actually made things worse for renters and better for landlords and corporate investors. They passed legislation that made it harder for local governments to implement rent control. They made it easier for landlords to evict tenants. They rolled back tenant protections that had been in place for decades. All of this was happening while Wall Street firms and international investors were buying up residential properties across the state, converting single-family homes into rentals, and driving up prices even further. And DeSantis sold all of this as freedom. He called Florida a free state. He talked about how people were fleeing high-tax states like California and New York to come to Florida for opportunity. And yeah, people did come. They came in droves. But what he didn't mention was that most of the people who moved to Florida weren't struggling families looking for affordable housing. They were wealthy retirees. They were remote workers from tech companies making Silicon Valley salaries. They were investors looking to flip properties or turn them into short-term rentals. The actual working-class Floridians got crushed in the process. Now the market's crashing, and suddenly everyone's acting surprised. Insurance companies are fleeing the state because of climate risk and the increasing cost of hurricanes. Property values are dropping in some areas while remaining completely unaffordable in others. Homeowners who bought at the peak are underwater. Renters are still paying astronomical prices, but landlords are struggling because they overpaid for properties that are now worth less. It's a mess from every angle, and the people suffering the most are the ones who had the least to begin with. DeSantis is facing backlash from multiple directions now. You've got progressive activists who have been warning about this for years, saying that his policies favor corporations over people. But you've also got conservative homeowners who voted for him, who believe in his vision of Florida, who are now watching their property values drop and their insurance premiums skyrocket, and they're asking what happened to all those promises about prosperity and opportunity. The insurance crisis alone is absolutely devastating. Major insurance companies have pulled out of Florida entirely. The state-backed insurer of last resort is overwhelmed and raising rates dramatically. People are being quoted $10, $15, even $20,000 a year for homeowners insurance, if they can get it all. And without insurance, you can't get a mortgage. Without a mortgage, you can't buy a home. The whole system is breaking down. And here's what makes this even more frustrating. This was predictable. Experts warned about this. Housing advocates warned about this. Climate scientists warned about this. But the warnings were ignored because they didn't fit the narrative that DeSantis wanted to tell. He wanted Florida to be the anti-California, the place where the market was free and government stayed out of the way, and everything would magically work itself out. Except markets don't magically work themselves out when you're dealing with basic human needs like housing. They need regulation. They need oversight. They need policies that protect vulnerable people from being exploited. Look at what happened with corporate landlords. Private equity firms bought up tens of thousands of homes across Florida. They used algorithms to set rents, coordinating price increases across entire markets. They fought against any attempt to regulate them. And DeSantis let it happen. His administration argued that this was just business, just a free market at work. But there's nothing free about a market where a handful of massive corporations control huge portions of the housing stock and use that power to extract maximum profit from people who have no choice but to pay because everyone needs a place to live. The backlash is also coming from younger Floridians who are completely locked out of homeownership. We're talking about people in their 20s and 30s who grew up in Florida, who want to stay in Florida, who work in Florida, but who have absolutely no path to ever owning a home there. They're watching their parents' generation pull up the ladder behind them. They're watching investors and out-of-state buyers snap up properties. They're stuck renting forever, paying someone else's mortgage, building no equity, with no stability and no future. And when they look at who's responsible, DeSantis' name keeps coming up. There's also the issue of short-term rentals, which DeSantis has consistently protected. Airbnb and similar platforms have converted residential neighborhoods into de facto hotel districts. Entire apartment buildings and condo complexes have been turned into short-term rental operations. This removes housing from the long-term rental market, drives up prices for everyone else, and destroys the character of residential communities. Other states and cities have implemented reasonable regulations on short-term rentals to protect housing stock. Florida under DeSantis has done the opposite, preempting local regulations and making it nearly impossible for cities to control the problem. Now let's talk about what happens next, because that's what everyone wants to know. Can this be fixed? Is there a way out of this mess? The honest answer is it's going to be really hard and it's going to take years, but it's possible if there's political will to make it happen. Florida would need to completely reverse course on housing policy. They'd need to implement real tenant protections. They'd need to crack down on corporate landlords and predatory practices. They'd need to incentivize affordable housing development, not just luxury condos and single-family homes for wealthy buyers. They'd need to address the insurance crisis with real solutions, not just Band-Aids. They'd need to tackle climate change honestly instead of pretending it doesn't exist. But here's the problem. DeSantis has shown no indication that he's willing to change direction. He's doubling down. He's blaming federal policy. He's blaming other states. He's doing everything except taking responsibility for the choices his administration made. And as long as that's the case, things are probably going to get worse before they get better. The bigger picture here is that Florida is a warning for the rest of the country. What happened there can happen anywhere. When you prioritize investors over residents, when you got protections for tenants and renters, when you let corporations buy up residential housing without limits, when you ignore climate risk and insurance problems, you get a housing market that works great for the wealthy and utterly fails everyone else. Other states are watching Florida right now, and they need to learn from these mistakes, not repeat them. For people living in Florida right now, this is incredibly difficult. If you're a renter, know your rights, even though they're limited. Document everything with your landlord. Look for tenant assistance programs and housing counseling services. If you're a homeowner struggling with insurance or an underwater mortgage, explore every option available to you. Reach out to housing counselors. Look into refinancing programs. Consider whether it makes sense to sell before things get worse. And regardless of whether you rent or own, get involved politically. Show up to local government meetings. Support candidates who prioritize affordable housing. Make noise. Demand change. The backlash against DeSantis is growing because people are hurting. Real people with real lives are being crushed by a housing market that's broken. They're angry, and they should be. They were sold a vision of Florida as a land of opportunity, and instead they got a state where only the wealthy can afford to live comfortably. So what's the bottom line here? Florida's housing crisis is a man-made disaster, made worse by specific policy choices from the DeSantis administration. The backlash he's facing is deserved, and it's probably going to intensify as more people feel the pain of this imploding market. And the rest of us need to pay attention, because the forces that broke Florida's housing market are at work in states across America. If we don't learn from what happened there, we're going to see this pattern repeat over and over until housing becomes something only the wealthy can afford anywhere in this country. That's not the future any of us should accept. Thanks for watching. If this video opened your eyes to what's really happening with housing, please share it with your friends and family. Drop a comment below telling me what housing issues you're facing in your area. And seriously, hit that subscribe button, because we're going to keep covering this story and holding politicians accountable for the housing crisis they're creating. We're all in this together, and together we can demand better. See you in the next one.